You know, there's a specific kind of silence you only find when you're miles away from the nearest paved road. A silence that smells like pine needles and wet earth. The kind of quiet I bought with 20 years of blood and hearing loss in places that don't exist on tourist maps, hoping to wash away the memories of loud, chaotic rooms with 100 acres of nothing in Blackwood County. It was supposed to be the end of the line for me. Just me, my old tractor that leaked oil like a sieve, Buster, my German shepherd who'd seen more combat than most infantrymen, and a stubborn goat named Bessie who thought she was the queen of the Appalachians. But that silence, the one I cherished more than my own pension, was shattered on a Tuesday morning not by gunfire, but by a piece of white plastic zip-tied to my fence like a parasitic growth, a sign that shouldn't have existed in this reality. Reading Property Under Review, Oak Ridge Estates, Compliance Mandatory. Which made absolutely no sense because the nearest subdivision was 40 miles away and inhabited mostly by meth cooks and deer. I tore the sign down, assuming it was just some bored teenagers playing a prank, tossing it into my burn barrel with a laugh. But that laugh died in my throat 2 days later when a pristine, pearl-white SUV crunched up my gravel driveway, looking like a spaceship landing on Mars, and out stepped a woman who looked like she had been manufactured in a factory that specialized in passive-aggressive nightmares. She was wearing a pastel blazer that cost more than my truck, holding a clipboard like a weapon of war, and introduced herself as Patricia Sterling, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, smiling with teeth that looked too white to be real, while she explained that my property was currently in violation of visual harmony statutes and livestock density protocols. I stood there on my porch, coffee mug in hand, looking at this woman standing in 2 inches of mud in her designer heels, and I actually chuckled, telling her she was trespassing and that the only association out here was the association of me and my shotgun. But she didn't even blink, didn't flinch, just handed me a thick packet labeled Remediation Required, and told me they don't find the animals, only the owners, before spinning around and driving off, leaving me standing there with a dossier that contained satellite photos of my barn circled in red marker. It felt funny at first, like a skit from a bad comedy show, until the enforcers showed up a week later, 2 men in tactical vests that looked like they bought them at a surplus store Halloween sale, walking my perimeter with radios, marking trees with orange tape, and when I confronted them, they panicked, dropping a binder that wasn't filled with HOA bylaws, but with tactical maps of my property labeled Target Sector 1. High resistance. That's when the hair on the back of my neck, the hairs that had saved my life in Kandahar and Panama, stood up and screamed that this wasn't a joke. So I called Sheriff Brody, a good man who'd been trying to retire for a decade, and he told me that Patricia Sterling was a ghost, a woman with deep pockets who had been terrorizing the county with lawsuits for years, but he'd never seen her go this far, never seen her use paramilitary tactics. I started digging, not into the ground, but into my old habits, rigging motion sensors along the tree line, dusting off the thermal optics I hadn't touched since I left the service, and waiting, because I knew that Target Sector 1 wasn't a label you gave to a house with an ugly fence, it was a designation for an operation. The first probe came at 3 a.m. on a moonless night, a clumsy, amateurish infiltration by 5 guys trying to move like operators but sounding like a herd of elephants crashing through the brush, and I watched them on my monitors, sipping cold coffee, feeling that old, dark adrenaline flooding my system, realizing they weren't here to issue a fine. They were here to sanitize the area. They breached the outer fence, and I let them get comfortable, let them think they owned the night, until the point man tripped a tension wire I'd buried near the trough, triggering not an explosive, but a bank of 10,000 lumen stadium lights I'd rigged to the barn roof, instantly turning the pitch-black night into a blinding white supernova while a recorded loop of police sirens blasted from hidden speakers, disorienting them so badly that one guy ran straight into Bessie's pen, and I watched with grim satisfaction as my prize goat, who hated intruders more than I did, lowered her horns and punted a grown man into the mud like a football. I walked out onto the porch, backlit by the floodlights, looking down at these terrified cosplayers scrambling in the dirt, and asked them if they wanted to try the front door like civilized people or if they preferred the barnyard rodeo. And the leader, a guy clutching a clipboard like it was a holy relic, stammered that they were authorized under Article 15 of the Community Preservation Act, a law that didn't exist in any book on earth. Sheriff Brody rolled up 10 minutes later, lights flashing, and arrested the whole lot for trespassing and assault. But as he was cuffing the leader, he found a laminated card in the guy's pocket that didn't say HOA Patrol. It said Project Sovereign, Tier 3 Enforcement, and underneath that, a list of names. My neighbors, some crossed out, some circled, and next to my name. It didn't say homeowner. It said anomaly. Brody looked at me, his face pale under the strobe lights, and whispered that this was bigger than a crazy lady with a clipboard, that Patricia Sterling had bail posted before her fingerprints were even dry, and that the lawsuit she filed against me the next morning wasn't for harassment. It was for domestic insurrection, a charge that shouldn't even be possible for a civilian to file. The town turned against me almost overnight, flyers appearing on telephone poles warning people that I was a destabilizing element, the cashier at the grocery store refusing to look me in the eye, and even Tom Higgins, a neighbor I'd shared beers with for years, suddenly stopped answering my calls, until I cornered him by his tractor, and he broke down, weeping, telling me they threatened to take his kids, threatened to expose things from his past if he didn't report on my movements. It was isolation, pure and simple, a textbook psychological siege designed to break a target without firing a shot, cutting off supply lines, social support, and sanity. But they made one critical mistake, one fatal error in their calculation of who I was and what I was capable of. They hurt my dog. I found Buster whimpering behind the tool shed, a jagged, clean slice across his paw pad, bleeding into the dirt, and when I swept the area, I found shards of crushed glass that had been deliberately mixed into his favorite sleeping spot, green glass that didn't belong to any bottle I owned, placed there with malice, with the specific intent to cause pain to an innocent animal just to send a message to me. That was the moment the switch flipped, the moment I stopped being a confused homeowner dealing with a crazy HOA and started being the man the government spent millions of dollars training to dismantle insurgencies from the inside out. Because you can threaten me, you can sue me, you can shine lights in my windows, but you do not touch the dog. I went dark, pulling down the blinds, disabling the obvious cameras while setting up hidden, pinhole lenses in the trees, and I started compiling a dossier of my own, documenting every drone flight that buzzed my roof, sleek, black military-grade quadcopters that were far too expensive for a neighborhood watch, and recording every frequency burst from the encrypted radios they were using. Sheriff Brody came by late one night, looking like he hadn't slept in a week, and dropped a file on my table that he'd pulled from a state database before his access was mysteriously revoked, revealing that Oak Ridge Estates wasn't a real estate development. It was a shell corporation funneling money from a D.C. consulting firm run by General Kincaid, a man I hadn't thought about in 15 years, a 3-star intelligence officer who I used to brief during the height of the Desert Wars. The pieces started clicking together like a bolt carrier group sliding into place. The tactical terminology, the specific psychological pressure points, the Tier 3 designations. It was all doctrine, my doctrine, twisted and repurposed. Patricia Sterling wasn't just a Karen. She was a handler, a field asset running a live-fire exercise on American soil, using a rural community as a petri dish to test how to subdue a resistant population. And I wasn't just a random obstacle, I was the stress test. I uploaded everything I had to a Dead Man Switch server, a cloud account that would blast the evidence to every news outlet and federal agency in the country if I didn't reset the timer every 12 hours. And then I posted a video, a simple tour of their enforcement tactics, the injured dog, the fake police badges, the threats, titling it, "When the HOA thinks they're the CIA," and it went nuclear. Millions of views in hours, tearing down their veil of secrecy. But exposing them didn't stop them, it accelerated the timeline. The Tier 3 cosplayers vanished, replaced by a terrifying silence that hung over the valley for 2 days, a silence that felt heavy, charged with static electricity, until Patricia Sterling walked up my driveway alone. No clipboard, no fake smile, just a cold, reptilian stare hidden behind designer sunglasses. She handed me a folder stamped with Department of Homeland Stability, a department that didn't exist, and whispered, "You think you're fighting a lawsuit, Mason, but you're fighting the future," before turning on her heel and walking away, leaving me with a document that outlined Project Sovereign in terrifying detail: population management, asset seizure, behavioral modification. I opened the file and my blood ran cold because I recognized the font, I recognized the formatting, I recognized the terrifyingly clinical language used to describe stripping citizens of their rights. It was based on a white paper I had written 2 decades ago as a theoretical exercise on counterinsurgency in hostile urban environments. Only now it was being applied to farmers in Iowa and mechanics in Kentucky. They weren't just using my tactics. They were using my mind against me, proving that the ultimate enemy wasn't some foreign power, but the unchecked ambition of a bureaucracy that saw freedom as a variable to be eliminated. That night, the atmosphere shifted from harassment to war. The crickets stopped chirping, the wind died down, and my thermal cameras picked up heat signatures moving through the deep woods to the north. Not 5 guys this time, but 3, moving with the liquid grace of professionals, no unnecessary movements. Weapons held at the low ready. These weren't the guys who got taken out by a goat. These were the cleaners, the Tier 1 assets sent in when the experiment goes wrong and the data needs to be wiped. And as I watched them breach the perimeter, I saw they were carrying suppressed rifles and zip ties, not citations. I sat in my kitchen, the lights off, watching them approach on the monitor, my hand resting on a remote detonator that controlled the hydraulic cattle barriers I'd buried in the driveway years ago. Not for cattle, but for this exact scenario, and I whispered to Buster, "Stay low, boy," knowing that the next 10 minutes would determine if we ended up in a prison cell or a body bag. The 3 figures stopped at the edge of the gravel, fanning out in a perfect triangulation pattern that screamed Special Forces training. And even though they were dressed in black tactical gear without insignias, I could smell the arrogance radiating off them, the confidence of men who operate above the law. The leader, a man whose thermal signature showed a heart rate that was barely elevated, stepped into the light of the porch, holding not a clipboard, but a tablet, and his voice was amplified by a speaker on his vest, cutting through the night like a scalpel. "Mason Thorne, you have been designated a non-compliant hostility node under Emergency Directive 7 Alpha. Exit the structure or we initiate sterilization." Sterilization. The word hung in the air, a sterile euphemism for murder, and I realized they weren't planning to arrest me. They were planning to erase me, to make my death look like a gas leak or a tragic accident, a loose and tied off in the dark. I didn't yell, I didn't bargain, I just pressed the button on my remote, and the ground beneath the driveway erupted with a mechanical groan as 4 solid steel bollards, thick enough to stop a tank, shot up from the earth, boxing them in, cutting off their retreat and their vehicle access in one violent motion. Simultaneously, the strobe lights kicked in again, but this time I synced them with a localized infrasound generator, a nasty piece of tech I'd salvaged years ago that pumped out a low-frequency hum designed to vibrate the fluid in the inner ear, causing instant, debilitating vertigo. The effect was visceral. 2 of the operators stumbled, clutching their heads as their equilibrium shattered, retching onto the gravel, their professional composure dissolving into biological panic. The leader, fighting through the dizziness, raised his rifle towards the window, but I was already moving, crashing through the side door, utilizing the chaos, flanking them while they were drowning in the sensory overload. I didn't shoot. I didn't want to give them the legal justification they were desperate for. Instead, I threw a flashbang, a sound and flash diversionary device that detonated with the force of a thunderclap, blinding them, deafening them, leaving them helpless as infants. I swept the leg of the leader, driving his face into the dirt, stripping his weapon, and zip-tying his hands before his vision could clear, and as the ringing in his ears subsided, he looked up at me, not with fear, but with a twisted kind of admiration, a smirk playing on his bloody lips. Sheriff Brody and a convoy of state troopers, real ones this time, called in by the sheriff's frantic coordination with the governor, screeched into the driveway, weapons drawn, surrounding the paralyzed mercs. As they hauled the leader away, he locked eyes with me and whispered, "The program isn't broken, Thorne. It worked perfectly. You were the final variable. General Kincaid sends his regards." And that's when the horror truly hit me. This wasn't a failure for them. It was data collection. I was the prototype, the alpha subject, and by fighting back effectively, I had just taught them exactly how a highly trained insurgent defends their home, providing them with the very data they needed to refine the system for the next town, the next victim who wouldn't have my training. The fallout was messy and unsatisfying, buried in redacted reports and closed-door hearings. Patricia Sterling was indicted on fraud charges but took a plea deal that sealed the records. General Kincaid retired quietly with a full pension, claiming rogue elements in his firm had acted without orders, and Project Sovereign was officially disbanded, which is government speak for renamed and moved to a different budget line. I still live on the land, but the silence is different now. It's not peaceful, it's vigilant, a watchful quiet where every snapping twig sounds like a boot step and every passing plane feels like surveillance. I won the battle. I kept my home, and Buster's paw healed with a jagged scar that matches the ones on my soul. But I lay awake at night wondering about that list, wondering about the other names in other counties, and asking myself the question that haunts me more than any ghost. If a man has to turn his home into a fortress to be free, was he ever really free to begin with? Or are we all just waiting for our turn on the list? We beat the fake cops. We exposed the fake HOA. But out here in the dark, watching the tree line, I can't shake the feeling that the real test is just beginning. Stay safe, watch your six, and never, ever sign the paperwork without reading the fine print.